Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on adding in our logic for encountering wild monsters in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links to the video description, to the source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so previously when we added in our logic for encountering wild monsters and transitioning to our battle scene and back to our world scene when the battle was over, we found an issue where our player's position would always be reset after our battle ended instead of being back to the position of where they encountered the wild monster. And so in order to resolve this, we're going to need to introduce some type of system for storing data that'll be persistent across our overall game state and not tied to one particular phaser scene. And so to do this, we're going to take a look at using Phaser's data manager to go ahead and store data. And what the data manager does is it's a component in Phaser that allows you to store pieces of data that can be tied to game objects, systems, or plugins, or any type of data that you want to store. And you can grab a reference from this data manager across your various scenes, or you can create your own instance of it to keep track of your data. And so to go ahead and get started, what we need to do is we actually need to go create a new class to create our data manager instance. So what we're going to go ahead and do is let's come over to our code. We'll go into our source code. Let's go into our utils folder. And then what we'll do is we'll make a new file and we're going to call this data manager.js. And what we're going to do is we'll make a new class. We're going to call it data manager and we're going to extend phaser events.event emitter. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and import in our phaser library. And what we need to do next is we need to go ahead and create our constructor. And we need to go ahead and call the super method since we are extending the event emitter. And then next, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create an instance of our data manager. So what we're going to do is we'll make a new property and we're going to make it private and we'll call it store. And we're going to set it equal to a new phaser data.dataManager. And then for our parent, that's going to be this instance of our class. So we'll go ahead and pass in this. And then what we need to do is let's go ahead and define our property on our class real quick. And then we'll go ahead and add in our type for our data manager. All right, so what we did here is we created a new class called Data Manager, and we extended the Phaser events event emitter. And the reason for this is when you create an instance of a data manager in Phaser, the parent object that this data manager belongs to needs to extend either the event emitter or have a property called events that is an instance of the event emitter. And the reason for this is the data manager emits events when data is set or updated on the data manager instance, and then you can listen to those events to know when data has been modified. And so in order for that to work properly, you need to go ahead and pass in an instance of our event emitter. So that's why we're extending our event emitter here, so that way when we create an instance of our data manager, it will have the required properties that we need. All right, so now we create our data manager. Next, we need to go ahead and create a getter to go ahead and return a reference to our store. And then that way, throughout our various scenes, we can go ahead and set and get data from our data manager. So what we're going to do is we'll add a getter, and we'll call it store. So we'll get an instance of our store, and so we'll return this, and then our store, and we'll go ahead and add in our type real quick for our getter. Oh, and then real quick, let's go ahead and fix our class name. And so for our data manager, we only want to have one instance of our data manager in our game, so like a singleton, and we don't want to create multiple instances. And the main reason for this is we want to store all of our data in one place, and we want to get it all from one place. Since we have multiple instances, this will make it harder to manage. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to export out a new variable, and we're going to call this data manager. And what this is going to be is this is going to be an instance of our data manager class that we created. And so instead of exporting out our class directly, we'll instantiate it here, and then we'll go ahead and grab this reference, this instance of it from our file here when we use it in our various scenes. And so then with our data manager, what we can do is with the phaser data manager, we can go ahead and use the methods to set and get data that we store. So as an example, if I grab a reference to our store and we call the get method, what this allows us to do is provide a key and an array of keys, and this is going to return the values for those keys that we provide if they exist. If they don't, it'll return undefined. And then we can use the set method. And so with the set method, we can provide a key or an object of key value pairs to go ahead and set data in our data manager. And then later on, we can retrieve those values. All right, so now that we have our data manager, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create an initial state that we want our data manager to have when our game first loads. And so this initial state will be used for setting up anything that we need in our game. And a good example of this will be our player starting position. Since we want to keep track of where our player is at in our game, we should move our player's position to our data manager, and then that way as our player moves, we can update the value and store it. And then that way later, when our scene restarts, we know where our player was. And so to keep track of all this, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to make a new variable, and we're going to call this initial state. And on this object, what we're going to do is we'll add a player property. This is going to be an object, and this is going to have all of our properties for our player. So we're going to have a position. And so on our position, we'll have an X value. And what we're going to do is we're just going to copy our values that we had initially for our player position. So we'll have 6 times our tile size, and then we'll have 21 times our tile size. Then we also need to keep track of our player's direction and what direction they were facing. So then that way when we come back to our scene, we put the player facing in that direction as well. And so we'll add direction, and this will be direction.down when we start our game instance. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and add in the type for our initial state here, just so we have our typings for it. So for our JR stock, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new type def for global state. It'll be an object, and then so for our object, this is going to reference our properties down here. So player is an object, player position is an object, and then on there we have 2 properties, X and Y, that are numbers, and then we have player direction is a direction. And then what we can go ahead and do is we can add our type to our initial state, and now we have that set. So now that we have our initial state, what we want to do is after we create an instance of our data manager, we want to go ahead and set that initial state. And so to do that, we'll come to our constructor, and what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and make a new private method. So we're going to call this update data manager, and we will pass in our initial state. So then what we'll do is after our getter, we'll go ahead and add in our private method, and we will go ahead and take in our data for our param we'll expect, and then we'll use this to set the data on our data manager. And so to go ahead and do that, what we want to do is we want to do this.store.set. And so in this method, we can either pass a single key as a string and then the value you want to set it to, or we can go ahead and pass in an object of key value pairs that we want to set. And so for storing and getting data from our store, we want to go ahead and create an enum for the possible keys that we can use. And then that way we can easily track throughout our code base what values we're storing here. And so what we're going to do real quick is we'll come above our class and we're going to make a new variable. And what we're going to do is we're going to export const, and we're going to call this data manager store keys. And this is just going to be an object of keys that we'll use for our data manager. And so we'll do an object freeze. And what we'll do is we're going to do player direction, and we're going to do player position. And then so for our values, we'll just use the same values as our key. And then what we're going to do is back down here where we're initially setting some data, we're going to use those as our keys. And so we're going to have our data manager store keys. We'll have our player position. And so for our player position, we're going to set that to the data that's passed in. And so this will be data player dot position. And then we want to do the same thing for our direction. And so we'll have our player direction, and this will be our player direction. Then real quick, we're just going to go ahead and add in our JS doc type here. And so for our data, this is going to be our global state, and we'll return nothing from this method. All right, so now in our code, when we create an instance of our data manager, all we're doing is we're just setting up some initial state with this key value pairs here. And so we have our player position and our player direction. Then what we should now be able to do is in our world scene, we should be able to grab our direction and our player position when we create an instance of our player game object. And so to go ahead and do this, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to come back to our world scene. Let's go ahead and get rid of our player position since we'll no longer need this. Then we'll come down where we create our player instance. And then for our player position, what we're going to do is we're going to import in our data manager. And then we are going to reference our store, so our phaser data manager. And now we're going to use that get method. And so with our get method, we can provide our key for the value that we want to pull. And so we're going to do our data manager, store keys, and we're going to get our player position. And so since we are setting an initial value, we know this will exist on our data manager that we created. And so now we'll have our player position come from here. And what we should be able to do is if we copy this, let's go ahead and paste that over our direction, and we'll do the same thing here. So now if we go ahead and save, we need to go ahead and fix one of our imports. Yes, so back in our data manager, we'll change config to config.js. And then we're just going to move our phaser import to the top of our file. All right, so if we go ahead and save, our scene should refresh, and it looks like there's no changes. But what's happening is now we're using our data manager to go ahead and grab our player's position. And so now we're using that to determine where our player starts in our scene. And because we're doing that, what we should be able to do now is after our player moves throughout our scene, we can update that value. And then when we come back to our world scene, we'll dynamically position our player on where they should be. All right, so to go ahead and do that, what we'll do is we'll come back to our world scene class, and we're going to go to our callback that we invoke for when our player finishes their movement. So come down to the bottom of our class, we'll be in our handle player movement update method. And so inside here, what we'll want to do is first, we're going to go ahead and set the data for our player's position. So after we check, so before we check for the encounter layer, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to grab our data manager. We'll grab a reference to our phaser data manager store, and then we're going to call this set method. And so here we can go ahead and provide the key we want to set. And so this will be our player position. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is on this object, we'll provide our X value. And so this is going to be our player, and it's going to be our sprite, so our game object, and then our X value. And then for our Y value, we'll do the same thing, but it'll be our Y property. And then right after this, we're going to go ahead and update our direction. And so for our key, we will do our player direction. And then we're going to go ahead and pass in this player. So instead of an object, our value is going to be this player, and it's going to be our direction. So then after we updated our position and our direction, we should be able to go ahead and test our changes. So if we come to our scene, let's go ahead and go into our encounter area and see if we can encounter a wild monster. All right, so we have our battle. Let's go ahead and just do a quick battle. All right, so we knock out the enemy monster. And now we come back to the world scene, and our player was in the position of where we left when we went to our battle scene. All right, so now that we've created our data manager and we verified that we can store our player's position and direction, that actually brings an end to this video. In our next video, we're going to take a break from our code and we're going to take a look at the program tiled. And so we're going to review what tiled is, how you can set it up, how we can use it to go ahead and create our level, and then add metadata to our level to go ahead and add in things like our NPCs, interactable objects, our encounter and collision layers, and much more. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in this series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.